Okay, done all the social media stuff. Hello and welcome to the stream. Parson reads the Book of Kings. I know it's been a while since I was last on. Last week was just insane. That's the only thing I could really say about it. Like the weekend, but okay, so I might as well kind of mention this and talk about it now because I know I should give an explanation of why I haven't been around for almost 2 weeks. And it started with like, what was it? Not last Saturday. Well, 2 Saturdays ago. I know it's already weird that tomorrow it'll be for like 3 Saturdays, but 2 Saturdays ago, it was just like the craziest day of like work related stuff and whatever. And so, I had to deal with all that. And then when Monday came around, I was so exhausted. I was so tired. So I was like, you know what? I'm just going to skip on streaming on that Monday. And then I ended up not streaming, 2 Mondays ago. Then the Friday came around, and that whole week was just like crazy with work. So I ended up just totally skipping out last Friday. I got home, and normally I would clean up like I did today before going on stream, whatever, right? But when I got home, I got cleaned up, and then I just like went to sleep, right? And then like not bothered to stream. So last Friday, I apologize for that, for not finishing the book. I should have finished the Book of Kings last week and then take this week off instead. But last week I was just so like pooped that like that didn't happen. So last Friday I basically slept through my own stream. Let's just say that. And then last month or Monday that we just had, I didn't mention this and I should have, but it was because it was Thanksgiving. I just ended up having plans and then wasn't able to stream on Monday. So that is why I haven't been around for the last little while. It's a good thing that like it doesn't take very long to upload a Heroes video because of course, as you already know, I record them before and then just kind of upload them. And the funny thing is that because Heroes Might Magic video, those are pretty small, like space wise for videos. They actually don't take very long to upload. Right? It takes me like once I actually film the dang thing, right? It takes me like 5 to 10 minutes tops to upload a Heroes Might Magic video. So that like on a Thursday when I come home from work, I just like set it up, upload, and then just hit the publish button, and then I just leave, right? So, but that's the reason why that's the reason why I haven't been around. But then today came around, I was like, okay, like I should stream today and finish off the Book of Kings for starters. So we're gonna do that. We're gonna finish First Kings, and then of course next week we'll continue with Second Kings. Anyway, so there's my little bit about why I haven't been around. I know you've probably been like, how come this guy's been reading his like doing his Bible reading videos? Lazy bum. But like, yeah, that's why I haven't been around. But anyway, that's enough of that. So today it's gonna be a shorter stream today because I'm just gonna finish First Kings, and I know I don't have very many chapters left. So we're just gonna read through them, and then I'll kind of summarize First Kings, and then kind of things to think about as we move into Second Kings. Even though, yeah, obviously you're supposed to. There really isn't a transition between First and Second Kings actually, and when I was compiling my notes, I thought about like, oh, why don't I just like start, read 2 chapters of Second Kings because they're really just a continuation of the ending of First Kings. But I think it's fine that we just finish First Kings on, this stream on First Kings, and then continue and start Second Kings next week, and allow Second Kings to have its own little introduction and all that. even though it really doesn't need an introduction, because it's just a continuation of First Kings, and there's really no break between them. It's not like there's any kind of time jump or anything. Nothing like that occurs. So, and then that was similar with the Book of Samuel, if you remember that, right? There was no real time jump between the end of First Samuel, Second Samuel, and so in a way, you didn't really have to treat them like they were two different books at all, because in a way, they're really not. So. But anyway, before we actually start reading, and we will start on chapter 20. So we're going to start from 1 Kings chapter 20. And I know there's only like 3 chapters left in 1 Kings, but we're just going to read them through. But before that, I'm going to start us off with a quick word of prayer. If you want to follow along, I am using the New International Version, or NIV. So I'll just start us off with a quick prayer. You guys can go look, use your Bible app or get Bible Gateway on your desktop or something, as I just start us off with an opening prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time that we have to read your word. And as we read the rest of 1 Kings, I just pray that you would inspire us to seek you and to be obedient to you and to not allow the past to define us. I pray that in the name of your Son, Jesus, amen. I really shouldn't do that. Like, just kind of like when you're playing with your fingers and you make those snapping noises in the middle of prayer. I have a bad habit of doing that, but anyway. I really should stop doing that, though. But I hope you guys are now flipped to 1 Kings chapter 20. Because here we go. Just diving right into it. Now Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, mustered his entire army, accompanied by 32 kings with their horses and chariots. He went up and besieged... Okay, I think I should set up better. Better posture will help me not cough. Let's try that again. So he went up and besieged Samaria and attacked it. Ben-Hadad sent messengers into the city to Ahab, the king of Israel, saying, "This is what Ben-Hadad says. Your silver and your gold are mine, and the best of your wives and children are mine. Ha ha ha." And the king of Israel answered, I don't remember what voices I gave these guys. Just who are you? Say, my lord the king, I and all I have are yours. The messengers came again and said, "This is what Ben-Hadad says. I sent to demand your silver and gold, your wives and your children. But about this time tomorrow, I am going to send my officials to search your palace and the houses of your officials. They will seize everything you have of value and carry it away." So the king of Israel summoned all the elders of the land and said to them, "See how this man is looking for trouble. When he sent for my wives and my children, my silver and my gold, I did not refuse him." The elders and the people all answered, "Don't listen to him or agree to his demands." So Ahab replied to Ben-Hadad's messengers, "Tell my lord the king, your servant will do all you demand for the first time, but this demand I will not meet." They left and took the answer back to Ben-Hadad. Then Ben-Hadad sent another message to Ahab. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if enough dust remains in Samaria to give each of my men a handful." The king of Israel answered, "And tell him, one who puts on his armor should not boast like one who takes it off." But Ben-Hadad heard this message while he and the kings were drinking in their tents, and he ordered his men, "Prepare to attack." So they prepared to attack the city. Meanwhile, a prophet came to Ahab, king of Israel, and announced, "This is what the Lord says. Do you see this vast army? I will give it into your hand today, and then you will know that I am the Lord." "But who will do this?" asked Ahab. The prophet replied, "This is what the Lord says. The junior officers under the provincial commanders will do it." "And who will start the battle?" Ahab asked. The prophet answered, "You will." So Ahab summoned 232 junior officers under the provincial commanders. Then he assembled the rest of the Israelites, 7,000 in all. That's it. They set out at noon while Ben-Hadad and the 32 kings allied with him were in their tents getting drunk. The junior officers under the provincial commanders went out first. Now Ben-Hadad had scouts who reported, "Men are coming from Samaria." And he said, "If they have come out for peace, take them alive. If they have come out for war, take them alive." Okay. He could have just said take them alive, period. He didn't have to make the two conditions if he was going to make the result the same. The junior officers under the provincial commanders marched out of the city with the army behind them, and each one struck down his opponent. At that, the Arameans fled, with the Israelites in pursuit. But Ben-Hadad escaped on horseback with some of his horsemen. The king of Israel advanced and overpowered the horses and chariots and inflicted heavy losses on the Arameans. Afterward, the prophet came to the king of Israel and said, "Strengthen your position and see what must be done, because next spring the king of Aram will attack you again." Meanwhile, the officials of the king of Aram advised him, "Their gods are gods of the hills. That is why they are too strong for us. But if we fight them on the plains, surely we will be stronger than they are. Do this, remove all the kings from their commands, and replace them with officers. You must also raise an army like the one you lost, horse for horse and chariot for chariot, so we can fight Israel on the plains. Then surely we will be stronger than they are." He agreed with them and acted accordingly. The next spring, Ben-Hadad mustered the Arameans and went up to Aphek to fight against Israel. When the Israelites were also mustered and given provisions, they marched out to meet them. The Israelites camped opposite them like two small flocks of goats, while the Arameans covered the countryside. The man of God came up and told the king of Israel, "This is what the Lord says, because the Arameans think that the Lord is a God of the hills and not a God of the valleys. I will deliver this vast army into your hands, and you will know that I am the Lord." So for 7 days they camped opposite each other. And on the seventh day, the battle was joined. The Israelites inflicted 100,000 casualties, that's a lot of guys, on the Aramean foot soldiers in 1 day. The rest of them escaped to the city of Aphek, where the wall collapsed on 27,000 of them. And Ben-Hadad fled to the city and hid in an inner room. So his officer said to him, "Look, we have heard that the kings of Israel are merciful. Let us go to the king of Israel with sackcloth around our waists and ropes around our heads. Perhaps he will spare your life." So wearing sackcloth around their waists and ropes around their heads, they went to the king of Israel and said, "Your servant Ben-Hadad says, 'Please, let me live.'" And so the king answered, "Is he still alive? He is my brother." So the men took this as a good sign and were quick to pick up his word. "Yes, your brother Ben-Hadad," they said. "Go and get him," the king said. When Ben-Hadad came out, Ahab had let him come up into his chariot. "I will return the cities my father took from your father," Ben-Hadad offered. "You may set up your own market areas in Damascus, as my father did in Samaria." And Ahab said, "On the basis of a treaty I will set you free." So he made a treaty with him and let him go. By the word of the Lord, one of the company of the prophets said to his companion, let's do it again. Verse 35. By the word of the Lord, one of the company of the prophets said to his companion, "Strike me with your weapon." But he refused. So the prophet said, "Because you have not obeyed the Lord, as soon as you leave me, a lion will kill you." And after the man went away, a lion found him and killed him. So the prophet found another man. Oh, sorry, I didn't do the right voice of the prophet, but I'll do it this time. Verse 37. So the prophet found another man and said, "Strike me, please." So the man struck him and wounded him. Then the prophet went and stood by the road waiting for the king. He disguised himself with his headband down over his eyes. As the king passed by, the prophet called out to him, "Your servant went into the thick of battle, and someone came to me with a captive and said, 'Guard this man. If he is missing, it will be your life for his life, or you must pay a talent of silver.' While your servant was busy here and there, the man disappeared." "That is your sentence," the king of Israel said. "You have pronounced it yourself." Then the prophet quickly removed the headband from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And the prophet said to the king, "This is what the Lord says. You have set a man free I had determined should die. Therefore it is your life for his life, and your people for his people." Sullen and angry, the king of Israel went to his palace in Samaria. Okay, that was a lot to read there. Chapter 20 was a lot longer than I thought it was. So let's break it down. So there's a lot of events here, and I guess it's one of those more like, it's more focused on the king characters here, because it, after all, sets up more of how bad Ahab is. Of course, there are going to be some parts where, I get when people give the criticism of like, oh, well, God doesn't appear to be very nice, because here, God demands that like Ahab kill off, Ben-Hadad and all his guys, right? But of course, Ahab doesn't do that, right? Ahab is a lot more self-interested. And, the easy Christian answer would be, well, Ahab's sin was disobedience to God and being, selfish, right? Even though, yes, like he does things that are conventionally, the things that we should do more, right? Like Ahab spares Ben-Hadad. He doesn't just outright kill him. He doesn't, he's not a brutal, Ahab ends up not acting brutally. But one of the things, and I know some people will have gripes and say like, well, why is God so mean here with like, asking that the Arameans be eliminated, why Ben-Hadad should just be killed and all that. And so, but I mean, I'm sure there are reasons. I don't think the Bible really gives us a lot of them. It's just that the simple reasons would be like, well, Ben Hadad is not a good guy you want to keep around. So the answer I'll give you is that perhaps God, despite how bad Ahab is, God is still interested in preserving Israel, right? And so, what is in the best interest of preserving Israel would be to kill off Ben Hadad, who we know, and the Bible even tells us that Ben Hadad he's actually a pretty, like, he would not have shown them, he would not have shown the same mercy Ahab showed him, right? Because remember, in the beginning of chapter 20, Ben Hadad shows up, and he's kind of an asshole, right? He's just like, he just demands, like, yo, give us your silver, your gold, your women, and your children, right? And basically implying that they're just gonna kill all the men, right? Or at the very, very least, leave them absolutely destitute of, like, their stuff, right? And then leave them to die, kind of thing, right? Like, Ben Hadad clearly, you know, wants to destroy the men of Israel. And then the funny thing is, when in his impatience he, ups up the ante and says, "Hey, we're not just gonna we're gonna take all your stuff, right? We're not just gonna take your gold, silver, women, and children. We're gonna loot all your finest houses and take whatever we want, right? And basically have our way with you." And so, Ben Hadad, not a nice guy, right? And so I know some people would say, well, God is super mean for wanting to kill this guy. But at the same time, I mean, if you met a guy like Ben Hadad, you'd probably want to kill him too. So I wouldn't stack that against, like, oh, God is kind of mean for wanting to have Ahab kill this guy, despite the fact Ahab himself is not a good guy, right? But the simple answer would be that God is interested in the preservation of Israel, and so it is in their best interest to kill off, a dangerous aggressor. And it's one of those things that, like, a lot of people misinterpret. And I never really covered this. I mean, I might have. I mean, I've done so many, like, Bible reading videos at this point. It's weird to think I've been doing this for over a year now. At least on this channel. I've done it longer on Twitch, and of course, it's one of those funny things when you've been a pastor, and there's only so many passages you could possibly preach on, and so many different ways you could present the same message. So, so I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this at some point. But it's what. Excuse me, I have this bad cough. But one of the things that a lot of people misunderstand about when you're reading the Bible, some of the stuff God does in, especially the Old Testament, and a lot of people have the false idea that, God is this meanie in the Old Testament, and he's a lot nicer in the New Testament in the person of Jesus. Although, for obvious reasons, that's actually not true at all. It's actually, contrary to popular belief, Jesus is way meaner in the New Testament than he is in as the Father in the Old Testament. He's actually way meaner if you think about it. And if you actually read the Bible, accurately, Jesus is actually way meaner in the New Testament. I know that some people may think that's a crazy statement and it's far out there, but if you actually read the Bible, you'd quickly pick up on that. The simple example, if I'll just give you one example, but there's a lot of them like this in the New Testament, and once you actually start reading it, you'd see what I mean. And this is in, like, the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus talks about the cutting off your hand thing if your hand makes you sin thing, right? So the pretext to that was Jesus says, I think it's like Matthew 7, maybe still be Matthew 6. I think it's the late Matthew 6. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount goes from, like, chapter 5 to chapter 8, right? So, but I think it's still relatively early in it. And one of the things he says is, it was said, referring to the Old Testament, that you shall not commit adultery. Okay, yeah, it's a pretty serious rule, and I know a lot, in our modern age, not a rule people really care to follow. But in the Old Testament, it's like, okay, the rule is don't commit adultery. And then Jesus then follows up by saying, but I say to you, even if you look at a woman with lust, you've committed adultery in your heart. And so the contrast is that in the Old Testament, not that God doesn't already possess telepathy or anything like that, right? But despite the fact that God obviously has telepathy, in the way the Old Testament is written, as far as the laws are concerned, God doesn't really care all that much, minus the whole coveting thing. But in a lot of ways, God doesn't care as much about like your motive for things. A lot of the laws that were given to the Israelites was the idea that like it's the action that matters. So don't commit adultery. It's pretty straightforward, right? But then when Jesus says, but I say to you, if you look at a woman lustfully, and of course there's the context of obviously he's talking to men who obviously are married or whatever, because the adultery rule is pretty specific, right? Two unmarried people cannot commit adultery. So when Jesus says, if you think about it, then you've sinned, right? And so when Jesus brings that up, he's actually being a lot stricter. He's actually telling you to actually control your thoughts a lot better. As opposed to the Old Testament, God didn't really hammer that down. So in a way, Jesus's, statement about even if you think about it, you've committed adultery, then that's actually far more severe than the act of it, right? Because it's one of those funny things too. And if you ask any person honestly, and this is another thing that the New Testament gets at when it's like, we've all sinned because we've all thought of doing it. And the very thought of doing it, you've already committed it. Which Jesus actually set that up, not the Old Testament. So going back to, you're probably wondering why I'm doing this whole tangent on like the New Testament. And the other thing too, from a philosophical level, I might as well finish up this thought before I go back to Book of Kings. The philosophical aspect to why Jesus would be a lot more strict when he was doing the Sermon on the Mount is because of the evolution of thought, right? And so, and some people make this assertion correctly, where it's like, well, when God was giving the laws in the book of Exodus, he's communicating with a much more primitive people in comparison to Jesus in the New Testament. Of course, 1,200 years, is, give or take, is a pretty long time, right? And in 1,200 years, thought can evolve quite a lot. And so, by the time Jesus shows up, there's the assumption, and I make the joke that maybe God thinks too highly of us humans, but there's the assumption that God assumes that human thought has evolved enough and that we were ready for much more concrete understanding of the law. And that's kind of a way to understand why Jesus is much more strict in the New Testament than as opposed to when people think God is being in the Old Testament. That's actually not true at all. Going back to the Book of Kings now, was the idea that, well, okay, so God orders like Ahab to kill off Ben-Hadad. But if you really, the simple way of looking at it is that, like, in a way, God is thinking about Israel's well-being. And that's why he would give such a command, because what's the alternative, right? And that's the other thing too, and that sometimes when you read the Bible at face value, we tend to forget to really think about like how the Bible story would play out in real time, if that makes sense, right? I know I'm using like a weird video gaming method here, but think about like how you, in real time, right? Referencing stuff like real-time strategies, go watch my StarCraft 2 playthrough for a good glimpse of that. And anyone who's played a MOBA, right? And in real time, a lot of things are, there's a lot of other dimensions than just what you're doing on screen, right? Because the map is a lot bigger than the arena, what your screen sees. The arena is much larger. And you have to evaluate what is going on everywhere, even though you can't see most of it. You have to, that's what it means to think in real time, right? At least from the gaming perspective, of course, is, just real time in real time, right? Like when you have to make split decisions about anything, right? You don't get like, it's not like in a game like Phoenix Wright where you have an infinite amount of time to think, right? In real time, you've got to come up with thoughts in a time limit, right? Because you only have so much time to come up with your next thought before you have to act. And with that being said, that's exactly what's going on here. When we read scripture and we read stories like this, we should be very mindful of how it would play out in real time. And so going back to Ben-Hadad and, his whole demands of like taking all Israel's stuff and killing all the men and all that, how else would you respond, right? If you had to make a decision, you're naturally going to be like, no, like, eat a dick, right? If someone, like, and that's the other thing too, when people read a Bible story and they think, well, why would God do this? Tell Ahab, a guy who's clearly not a good guy himself, but God would still, want to keep him alive and to have him defend himself, right? But of course, once you word it like that and you say it out loud, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, well, it would make sense for God to tell you to keep yourself alive, right? And so, and of course, once again, it's the people, like the country of Israel. And I think that's the interesting thing about in this particular story, because remember, we went from talking about Elijah last week, and the last few chapters focused on Elijah more. Then we went back to King Ahab, right? And it's focused on the high society, the top of the social strata now. Back with Ahab, right? And of course now the regular people are kind of forgotten, or they're not mentioned, but I would encourage you, don't forget about them as we read stories like this, right? You have to think about the ordinary people, right? And so what is in the ordinary person's best interest? Well, maybe not getting pillaged, maybe not getting, killed and letting a bunch of foreign men have their way with your women and children. Maybe you might have to do something about that, right? And what you might have to do might not be pretty. And God is 100% aware of this. I mean, the guy's got common sense, right? So God is telling him and is in a way giving permission for Ahab to, like, you are allowed to act in full force. Which is one of those things that, like, in our personal lives, if on a very personal micro level, it's easy to justify the same kind of things, right? The thought experiment of like, well, what would happen if a guy broke into your house, right? Are you allowed to use force, and how much force, right? And so, depending on context, some people would say a level of force is okay, some is more acceptable than others, right? So my personal take, if a guy broke into my house, I have people to take care of. It is my moral obligation to use as much force as necessary to make sure that not only is my attacker incapacitated, but to make sure they never try it again. So if killing is necessary, that would be a step I would take. Because, I have a moral obligation to, like, my family members to take care of them. And so, because what's the alternative, right? What if I did nothing and let someone into my house and have their way with my stuff or whatnot, right? Well, you don't know if the guy might just kill you, right, to take your stuff. That's the easiest way to take someone else's stuff, right? The guy might just kill me to do it, right? Could kill the rest of my family, right? So you don't know that. So you don't take those chances. And so, see, on a personal level, it's easy to justify those kind of things, right? And I know it sounds like, well, Michael, you're so terrible. You would actually be willing to kill somebody. It's like, well, if you've ever had your life in danger, which I have, I've had people, pull a knife on me even multiple times, actually. It gets rough when I used to be a security guard. It got pretty rough. I've had it happen multiple times, right? And you do what you have to do, right? Of course, when you're in some cases, it's not like I had to kill any of these guys, but you get the idea, right? I've hurt people in my life. Let's just say that, right? Because you have to. right? What's the alternative? Stand there, take a knife to the chest, right? Or to the face or something. I mean, a more permanent way to kill someone is to stab them straight in the face, right? Makes sense. But anyway, the point I'm getting at is, you do what you have to do. And so going back to now, I know another complaint people will say, well, if God is so all powerful and all that and all loving, why would God allow that to be the case? Why would God need to have people, have to fight to survive or whatever? Couldn't God just magically, like, make people not hurt each other or something stupid like that? Some kind of fairy tale, non-realistic way of God taking care of everything. Because I mean, in a way, yeah, God could do that. If he's, since he's all powerful, yeah, he could do that, I suppose. But that's not that's not realistic. And two, if God did that and would continuously do that, then human beings would have no reason to be good to each other. Because the assumption is if God does everything that's good and does it for everyone else, then we would have no reason to be good ourselves. God would just do it for us, right? And then what's the point of being good then? What's the point of acting morally or caring about things like the law or whatever if God could just magically fix anything that could occur, right? That would defeat the point of human beings being good to each other, right? Because, I mean, you think about it, it sounds, here's a ridiculous thought experiment, but just imagine it, right? If, let's say a guy was gonna do a school shooting, right? And then before he goes in, all of a sudden his guns just like start breaking down in front of him because God does some kind of magic thing and then his guns just break down, right? That wouldn't change him from wanting to hurt people. He would just be thwarted by some kind of magical force. But, and he could try over and over. But then sure, he might have like a moment where it's like, okay, maybe what I'm doing is wrong. But you think about everyone else and think about like, well, I guess like we don't have to care about anything, nobody has to worry about, doing anything to protect children. You don't have to worry about making rules for children to keep them safe, right? If God was just going to magically do stuff like that. Of course, in a utopian universe, I guess that could work, right? Because then, nothing bad would ever happen. But of course, then the other problem would be then you run into the other problem of, well, then we're just machines then, right? We don't really exist in a real world, right? And then the whole problem of like, do humans have free will? Well, in a world like that, then we wouldn't, right? And then of course that would bring up a different problem and would make God kind of a dictator, right? Which would have its own problems, right? Because then if God is this kind of dictator, then he wouldn't be trustworthy, right? Because if you wanted to do anything, even if something that would be constituted that you think is like, oh, it's pretty harmless or whatever, and then God just stops you from doing it, right? That is that's tyrannical behavior. And of course, a God like that would, everybody would be opposed to a God like that, right? So there's that side of it too. The point I'm just trying to lay home to rest now, and hopefully I never have to bring this up ever again, which obviously that's not going to happen, but just to kind of lay down this point home is that when God calls for like, oh, you have to fight and kill these people, is because God is giving a real solution to a real problem. God does not act on hypothetical, which I know is a very weird thing to think because, God has all these magic powers. You can just stop things if you wanted to. But instead, God does things in real time and acts in ways that are indicative of the real world, right? Things that would make sense in the real world, not just like magical things. Excuse me. But I mean, yeah, obviously there's the exception, and those are miracles. But for the most part, God actually allows things to occur in the real world as real events. Finally, we have this other weird part with this prophet guy. Don't really know who he is, right? He's just some other prophet. But I guess the whole point of this guy's appearance is the idea that, like, remember last week or 2 weeks ago, I guess now, when we were talking about the Elijah story and Elijah's whole depression phase, even suicidal. Elijah had this whole depression phase, and he was making this claim that he was the only prophet, he was the only follower of God and all that. And then God was basically telling him, no, that's not true. I have others, right? There are 7,000 that never bend a knee to Baal and all that. This prophet is just kind of to emphasize that point, right? There are other prophets around. Of course, they're not popular, and they're not Elijah. So the Bible kind of just like, well, here's this other prophet, right? One of the 7,000 or whatever, right? Does it matter which one? Not really. And so here's this prophet, and he acts powerfully, right? But of course, he's not spectacular like Elijah is, right? Because Elijah has like the ridiculous magic powers, right? The endless flask of oil and all that. This guy, he just kind of does what God tells him to do. It just says, okay, God told me to tell you this, and so here you go, right? And and so this guy's a prophet in a more basic sense, right? He just communicates what God wants the people to be told, or in this case, Ahab. And so that's what all this prophet really does. And there's that weird moment where like the prophet's like, "Oh, you better like attack me," and then this other guy's like, "I'm not gonna do that." And then like the prophet's like, "Well, since you didn't bother to attack me, you're gonna end up getting attacked and dying. So, have a good one, right?" And it just walks off. And then of course, the prophet ends up condemning Ahab for not doing what God wanted was better interest for Israel, which was to kill Ben-Hadad. And so because Ahab showed mercy, even though more often than not we're encouraged to show mercy in general, but of course there are exceptions to the rule. And of course what the Bible doesn't tell us, well, I mean the Bible hints at it, but doesn't flat out tell us. Like the Bible, I know somebody was gonna, if I don't say this, somebody is gonna say it and be like, where in the Bible does it say that Ben-Hadad is a bad guy and is worthy of being killed, right? The Bible never actually says that. Well, it's implied, right? Because I mean, if a guy is going to steal all your stuff and ravage your women and children, yeah, like that's a bad guy, right? Like, do I have to spell it out anymore, right? That's like to allow Ben-Hadad a pass despite his him saying that he would do that is the equivalent of saying like, well, if a guy says he's gonna rape your daughter, he can't be a bad guy though, right? Is he a bad guy just because he said that? Like, no shit, he is, right? So it like, and that's one of those other things too. When you read stuff like this, when people think, well, God like is kind of mean because he says like, oh, the Israelites should kill these people. It's like, well, yeah, because they're bad guys, and just because the Bible doesn't put it in big bold letters saying this guy is a bad guy, they say and do things that make them bad people. So what more do you need, right? And I mean, a guy who's like wanting to take all your stuff and ravage your women and children automatically jumps into the really bad guy list. But yet Ahab spares him, right? Because Ahab is obviously trying to play a different game here, right? Maybe he's trying to play a political game. We don't really, it's not flat out told to us. But whatever the case is, right? And this once again falls back into like, well, what would God be mad about with him showing mercy? And ultimately, what my guess is that Ahab is acting only in his own interest. And I say his own interest as in like he doesn't care. One, he doesn't care about what God says. So there's that. 2, he doesn't care about his subjects, because once again, it's in Israel's interest to not have dangerous people like this around. I mean, Ben-Hadad even attacks him twice in this one chapter, because in this one chapter, it's actually a span of over a year, right? 2 battles are fought in 2 different springtimes. So a year has obviously has lapsed in this one chapter. But yet, Ahab decides to not do the smart thing, right? Because who knows why, right? I mean, I assume it's a political reason. But Ahab should be more concerned with God than he is with his own agenda. Anyway, that's a lot of talking for one chapter, so I've spent too much time on chapter 20, despite the fact that my notes were actually very short on chapter 20. So, anyway, let's continue on. I did tell you this would be a shorter stream, so maybe I should keep to that, right? Alright, chapter 21. Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. Now the vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, the king of Samaria. Ahab said to Naboth, I think it's actually pronounced Naboth, so that's how I'm going to pronounce it from now on. Let me have your vineyard to use for vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth. But Naboth replied, The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my ancestors. So Ahab went home, sullen and angry, because Naboth the Jezreelite said, I will not give you the inheritance of my ancestors. And so Ahab lay in his bed, sulking and refusing to eat. Now his wife Jezebel came and asked him, Why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat? He answered her, Because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, Sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. So Jezebel his wife said, Is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed a seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters, she wrote, Proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people. But seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them bring charges that he has cursed both God and king. Then take him out and stone him to death. So the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel directed in the letters she had written to them. They proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, Naboth has cursed both God and the king. So they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, Get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Oh yeah, he's back. Go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He is now in Naboth's vineyard, where he has gone to take possession of it. Say to him, this is what the Lord says. Have you not murdered a man and seized his property? Then say to him, this is what the Lord says. In the place of where the dogs licked up Naboth's blood, dogs will lick up your blood. Oh yeah, yours. So Ahab said to Elijah, so you have found me, my enemy. Crap, what voice did I give Elijah? I don't remember what voice I gave him. I need to think of a new voice for him. Well, he's older now, so we'll give him an older man voice. Well, I can't do an old man voice all the time. I'll give Elijah the... Here's a fun voice for him. I have found you, he answered, because you have sold yourself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. He says, I'm going to bring disaster on you. I will wipe out your descendants and cut off from Ahab every last male in Israel, slave or free. I will make your house like the Jeroboam, son of Nebat, and that of Baasha, son of Ahiah, because you have aroused my anger and have caused Israel to sin. And also, concerning Jezebel, the Lord says, dogs will devour Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel. Dogs will eat those belonging to Ahab who die in the city, and the birds will feed on those who die in the country. There was never anyone like Ahab who sold himself to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, urged on by Jezebel his wife. He behaved in the vilest manner by going after idols, like the Amorites the Lord drove out before Israel. So when Ahab heard these words, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I won't bring disaster in this day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son. Alright, so that was chapter 21. A lot shorter than chapter 20. So basically we're told about how Ahab does something really awful and kind of the, that tipping point that's going to get him killed, right? So if it wasn't bad enough that Ahab decides to spare a pretty bad guy and makes an alliance with him, now he has to go do something, much more, blatant in defying God, let's say that, right? Because, I mean, what does he do here, right? Ahab kills a guy. Well, more like his wife does it. So Jezebel gets a guy killed, right? And Ahab is complacent about it. And so Jezebel has a guy murdered, basically, on false charges and all that. Just so, like, Ahab could take, like, something that belongs to him. Now, at first, Ahab was going to be somewhat reasonable, right? Pay the guy, for his vineyard. But, of course, apparently, Jezebel, like a lot of... how do I say this nicely? Jezebel, being the interesting character that she is, doesn't know how to take no for an answer. And so, Ahab is all sad that a guy said, someone would say no to the king. And then Jezebel's just like, but you're the king. You can do whatever you want. Which is not true, right? A king doesn't just get to go around doing whatever they want, right? A king is supposed to be the protector and servant of the people, right? Remember back in the book of Samuel, that was the original reason why people wanted a king, right? Was someone to fight their battles for them. And so God was like, fine, I'll give you a king that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to fight your battles, not demand all your stuff. They're allowed to tax you, because you got to pay the guy for, who's supposed to protect you. He's allowed to tax you, but he can't just take your stuff. He can't just do whatever he wants. But here's Jezebel thinking, you know what? No, we can just do whatever we want. And so she gets a guy murdered, which I guess goes higher in the no-no list than letting a bad guy live, right? Letting a bad guy live is bad enough, right? But remember, there's no commandment saying thou shalt not spare a bad guy, right? So, you know, letting Ben Hadad go doesn't make the top 10 list of bad things you could possibly do. But killing a guy just because he told you he wasn't going to sell you his vineyard, you know, murdering a guy, yeah, that goes on the list. And so, you know, Jezebel's basically, you know, done a very heinous thing. And Ahab is complicit about it. As a matter of fact, he's totally cool with it, right? Because then once Jezebel tells him, well, the guy's dead now, you know, you can take the vineyard. You can just go and take it. It is yours now, basically. And so, yeah, that may, you know, that's pretty bad thing for him to do. It's just to take advantage of that and to be complacent to evil. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us whether he knows that Jezebel did this, but it doesn't really matter either, right? Because if he really wanted to respect the guy, you know, saying no to the demand, you know, no to the offer and saying like, no, this is the land of my ancestors, you know, this has been part of my family for years. I'm not giving it up, right? Under other Jewish laws, if you read in like the book of Numbers, I think, or might be a little bit, I think it's Numbers. Doesn't really matter. Leviticus or Numbers, one of those law books. I do get some laws mixed up in them, but there's the whole thing about like how when Israel was to inherit parts of, you know, Canaan when they moved in, certain families were allocated parts of land, and of course the Bible wasn't really specific on this for obvious reasons. It would be impossible to do all that in one document. So basically, with Naboth the Jezreelite, it's assumed that this vineyard that he has always been part of his family when they moved into Canaan, right? That they had always been there. And so the interesting thing is that like he should have Ahab should have respected that. He should have respected that, at least that part of the code of honor. But of course, you know, there's part of it is the idolatry thing, right? And this is one of those things where why in at least the Judeo-Christian mind worldview and the idea of monotheism, what follows it is what's the term I'm thinking of? It's a monotheistic ethics is basically what I was getting at. There's a maybe that is the term for it. I don't remember what exactly the term is, but basically the idea that like, okay, if there's one God and he sets the rules, then those set of rules apply to everyone. That's kind of the idea. And so in those set of rules, there's also a code of honor that follows that, right? And it applies, you know, doesn't matter who you are, right? Those rules do apply. And so, but of course, with Ahab, you know, following all these different gods and whatever, one of the problems of polytheistic worldviews is that there isn't a monolithic, you know, there isn't a monolithic code of honor and way of living, right? Because, you know, logically you could say like, well, your God might say murder is wrong, but my God says I should do it. So I'm going to do it, right? Like that is what could happen in a polytheistic culture. And then you get chaos, right? Because then everyone just does their own quote unquote laws, saying that that's what their God does, and then they will do that, even though it violates, you know, all these other things, you know, other people's, other groups and other tribes, right? That's how racism is actually justified in polytheistic religions, right? And stuff like that, because of course, you know, when you have many gods, then the gods fight for who's the better one, and then whoever ends up on top, their people are on top, right? That was actually the justification of a lot of racism within India. Popular, you know, despite popular belief, you know, you don't think of like India and then people are like homogenized within Indian culture. This is far from true. As a matter of fact, it's a misnomer to refer to like Hindus believing in Hinduism, because that's actually not true at all. There is no such thing in the Hindu world as Hinduism, because there's no unifying element to that. It's Hinduisms, because there are many, beliefs within that, because of the many different gods that have different rules. And so this actually was a big problem in the more ancient world. Of course, as time passed, and of course a lot of it was probably due to the British influence, then the Hinduism, well, first of all, the caste system was kind of breaking down, right? And so, partly because of the British colonizers at the time, a lot of the caste system broke down. I mean, that's why the caste system even was a thing, right? Was the idea that like within the hierarchy of gods themselves and hierarchy of God himself, because Hinduisms have different expressions on how they understand the idea of God and gods. It's very convoluted. Maybe I could do a whole like lecture series on that one, but that's not for right now. The idea was that basically the idea I'm getting at is that like in polytheistic worldviews, you can just follow whatever rules you want, because different gods have different rules, and then you just pick and choose whatever you want. But in a monotheistic religion, one god sets the rules and it applies to everybody, right? And so part of that is a code of ethics that people are required to follow, right? Such as keeping your word. And so, for example, when implications of like do not lie, when God gave the commandment of do not lie, there was a big emphasis on how you use your words and to be truthful, and not just truthful, but if you say something, you have to honor it, because that's part of being truthful, right? Because if you, let's say you say, oh, you're going to do a favor for somebody, right? Let's say you're going to take a buddy out for drinks, in like tomorrow night. And you tell him, you go like, hey dude, let's go for drinks tomorrow night, it's 7 o'clock at this place, whatever, right? And you both consent and you both confirm that like, yeah, that's what we're doing. Tomorrow, 7 night, we're going to go for drinks, right? If you bail for no reason, right, you've broken your word, right? And so in a sense, you have spoken falsely. Now, it's not exactly a lie in a conventional sense, but you have still misspoken and spoken falsely. And that's why the Bible uses that more weird wording of like giving false testimony to your neighbor, because it's not just lying. It can be stuff like that, right? Where you say things that can become untrue as well, right? And part of that was like there was a code of ethics within that. And if you read in the book of Leviticus, they actually cover some of this, and this is where Jesus gets that famous, don't make promises, the do not make oaths passage in Matthew 6, going back to Matthew 6 again. And Jesus tells, his disciples on the Sermon on the Mount, don't make promises. Make your yes, yes, and your no's, no's, right? Don't make these long-winded promises and swear under heaven or whatever, right? Don't do that, because, you don't know if you have the ability to maintain anything you say. And so to make things easier for yourself and to maintain good ethics and a code of honor, don't promise more than you can give, right? And so there's a sense of a code of ethics and honor that Jesus assumes in that passage. And that's not a new idea, right? That was something very well embedded in the old law, in the book of Leviticus. Is the idea that you have to honor your word, and you have to honor someone else's word. Now, of course, Jezebel gives them this weenie dog kind of excuse of why not to honor that word, right? Because, oh, the guy's dead now. So it doesn't matter. He can't say no. You know, a dead person can't say no, right? A dead person, consent is not a concern for the dead, right? And so Ahab then takes the property as his own, having no sense of honor. And so he's dishonored essentially fellow Israelites. Now the interesting thing is that, God gets Elijah to call him out on this. And there's an interesting thing here to really think about, and that's the idea that, status is irrelevant before God, right? It doesn't matter if you're a king, right, or a person, just a regular commoner, right? We all have to maintain ethics and codes of honor. And so here, because Ahab had dishonored this guy's wish of, no, his land is going to stay in the family's land, right? It belongs to his family. And of course, if you read through the book of Ruth, this kind of thing plays out in a different way, right? Where in the book of Ruth, there's this whole business about crap. What's the guy's name? Naomi's husband. I can't remember his name. I'll just look it up. But basically, he has this land, right? But because Naomi has no male kin, at least no close ones, because her two sons are dead. They're gonna she's basically gonna sell it to a distant male relative, and so at first, Boaz's cousin, I guess we could say, like an older cousin or a next in line cousin, is the first one considered, right? And then let me just look it up. What is this guy's name? The dude's name is Elimelech, Naomi's husband. So Elimelech has land, right? But then, because he left during the famine, his land was kind of left alone, but it still counts as his land. So when Naomi comes back years later with Ruth, the land is still technically Elimelech's, and so there's the whole dispute of who's going to buy it. And technically, Boaz has an older cousin that is first in line, and so Boaz talks to him and does the whole like, oh, Naomi's selling the land to a distant relative, because the next in line gets dibs, right? And then the story plays out, right? That eventually the cousin says, oh, it would actually be a problem if I married Naomi, which would come with the land. And so he then passes it off to Boaz. But anyway, that's his own story. But anyway, going back to Ahab here, right? He doesn't honor that at all, right? He acts very dishonorably in that sense. And so the fact that, rank and class doesn't matter. The fact that Ahab is the current king of Israel is irrelevant. He has done something extremely dishonorable, and God is calling him out on it. Now, of course, many Christians use the simple line that he has committed sin, which obviously is true. Dishonor is a type of sin. And dishonor is a very specific type of sin, right? So that's why I'm going to just refer to it as that specific sin. That's the sin he committed, right? Is to dishonor, the Jewish law. So first of all, he's dishonored God in that sense, right? Because God set up that rule of how land is to be given to family, like how it works in families, as opposed to like, just because you're the king, you can't just take it, right? And so he's dishonored God. He dishonored Naboth, just because the guy's dead doesn't mean that you can just do whatever you want with his stuff, right? That's why we have the whole next of kin system in general, right? Stuff will move to family members because it's a family issue, right? When we deal with life and death, and so there's that. So Ahab dishonors Naboth, his word, right? And so, and now of course, I know a lot of people would easily like be like, oh yeah, like it makes sense, just because you're a person in power doesn't mean you just take advantage of the poor guy or whatever, right? And that's where a lot of social justice ideas come from, which there's some legitimacy to that. when it's correctly merited, like here, right? Like Ahab can't just do whatever he wants because he's the king. So that's something important to consider. And God is not happy that Ahab thinks he can get away with that, right? That he can just do whatever he wants. So he gets Elijah to return to the scene, and Elijah says, like, hey, because you've committed evil, God will return that evil, and it's going to be brutal, right? To be told that your family's going to get ripped apart by dogs and birds, yeah, that sucks, right? And then, of course, Elijah he calls it at its fundamental problem, right? It's like, well, your wife Jezebel is like the embodiment of evil, right? Like she's the one who really did this crime, and so she will actually have a very brutal end, right? That the dogs will devour her by this wall of Jezreel, which I assume they were standing at the time, right? Because if Ahab went to the garden of Naboth the Jezreelite, he's in the area, and the wall is probably like the castle wall just over, right? After all, the Bible did tell us that Naboth lives next to the castle. That's why Ahab wanted the vineyard in the first place. And so it's interesting when Elijah mentions that, like, at the wall of Jezreel, I assume they're standing next to it. And then he says, like, yeah, it'll be here. This very place where we're talking is where your wife is going to get ripped apart by dogs, which is like, damn, that's hardcore, right? That's what I have to say about that. That's hardcore. But I guess that's how serious, God takes like dishonor, right? Which is why, just on a weird tangent here, that's why honor is such an important thing, right? In any culture, right? And why you find in a lot of like Asian cultures have a huge emphasis on honor, you know, medieval Europe, European, chivalry and stuff like that. It's all about honor, right? Honor is such a very high virtue because dishonor is such a grave sin. I know that's a weird way of thinking of it, right? Because, when we think of other worldviews and other religions, like, for example, in Shintoism and Buddhism and stuff like that, there's an honor system, right? But we don't view it in the same, we wouldn't, because, like, we're thinking in the context of, like, in Shintoism and the idea of honor, in that context, most people wouldn't think of, like, dishonor as a sin in the Judeo-Christian sense, right? Like, dishonor is a sin. We wouldn't, but at the same time, I think this is where, once again, the monotheistic ethics, despite, now I'm not trying to promote that, all religions are the same. I'm not saying that at all either. But of course, this is why we do once again, I would say that, like, okay, there is one God, and the question that every religion tackles is, who is that God, right? That would be the more accurate way of looking at it. But with that being said, though, the issue when you think of stuff like honor, right, and how it's prevalent in every culture, because God had given that sense of honor, to different cultures, and of course, how cultures cultivate that may differ. That's diversity, right? And how cultures cultivate that, but in a way, God planted into, in every nation. And this is where a lot of people, you kind of miss the point when people say, like, well, okay, you read the Bible and it's only in the middle, everything takes place in the Middle East. Well, what about, like, other parts of the world where, why doesn't God do anything there? It's like, well, the Bible can only tell you so much, right? And the Bible isn't concerned with telling, like, this 5,000 page, narrative about 1 year of the world, right? The Bible's not interested in doing that. But you could make the safe assumption that, like, okay, God inspired someone in Japan and the honor system, and that's where they developed Bushido from, right? There's nothing weird about that idea, right? Because, of course, one of the things that the Bible points at in other books, not in the Book of Kings, but in, like, the Book of Jonah is a good example of this. Is like, well, God isn't just a God of, like, downtown, Israel, right? Yahweh isn't the God of downtown Tel Aviv, right? But he's the God of not just the world, but he's, you know, the God of the cosmos as well, right? So it wouldn't be a far stretch if he's the God of the cosmos, you know, to be able to communicate with people no matter where they are, right? So, and then of course there's, you know, God has a sick sense of humor in some of these Old Testament books where he'll actually use secular means to get his point across, right? Like there's a part in the book of Jonah, once again, there's a part where a bunch of guys, they cast lots to figure out, well, whose God is punishing us, right? And then of course the, you know, the guys are drawing lots, like what's the chances of you drawing the right, you know, the correct lot? But God obviously uses that to communicate that, like, no, it is Jonah who is the blame, right? Because he disobeyed me, kind of thing, right? So it's not a far stretch of the imagination, is what I'm trying to get at. Of all things to imagine, that is not the hard one, right? So that God can communicate a sense of honor to different cultures, and then how different cultures cultivate that may be different, but the fundamental idea of, like, there's honor, and then committing dishonor would be a sin, right? And how different cultures dealt with that was different, right? Some more extreme than others as well, right? Because you think of, like, okay, let's use like Bushido as an example, right? And how serious they take the idea of honor and dishonor as a sin. Of course, they, in Bushido itself, you wouldn't hear that terminology, because once again, sin is a, the way I'm using the word sin and is more of a, you know, the Judeo-Christian concept. But, you know, the idea of dishonor is such a grievous offense that you could be killed for it. Like, that seems kind of ridiculous, right? But that's how serious honor was in, like, Japanese culture and in the code of Bushido, right? You can be killed for committing dishonor. And so, in the same way, in the Book of Kings, what I'm trying to get at here is that the code of honor works in a very similar way, right? Of course, what makes it kind of scary in the Bible is that God acts as the, you know, the judge here, right? When you've committed the act of dishonor, right? You know, in like samurai culture, you know, like there's the tier of the, like, the shoguns and whatever, right? And there's different levels within that. So, like, ranks of shogun, because there's like the supreme shogun, and then there's like other, like, lower levels, you know, hierarchies, right? So, and then they would decide, you know, the shoguns would decide how, you know, lower levels, you know, citizens and samurai in particular would be punished for acts of dishonor, right? Well, in the Bible here, skip all the shoguns, right? We're going straight to the top dog here. You know, God saying, like, well, I'm going to execute judgment, you know, for this dishonor. And so, and it's pretty apparent that we read in, you know, Kings here, that God is pretty serious, right? The act of dishonor is warranted of dogs ripping you apart. That's pretty damn severe, right? Like, that's really severe way of, like, God enacting judgment, right? Which, yeah, this is where a lot of people would say, like, well, this is where, like, God is kind of mean, right? Like, just because a guy acts dishonorably would not be, like, worthy of, like, a brutal execution for all intents and purposes. But once again, I use the samurai illustration to kind of convey the point that, like, it's not really a far stretch because humans do it. So if people do it, and we would say that it's totally fine when they do it, right? Once again, referring to the shogun system and, you know, seppuku in Bushido culture, right? Most people would be like, yeah, totally normal, right? And if we're going to be consistent with logic, if we're going to be cool with shoguns deciding that seppuku is a worthwhile punishment for dishonor, God enacting this kind of punishment for a dishonorable king would not be a very far stretch from that, right? That was the point of why I explained all that, by the way. Anyway, let's finish up with chapter 22. Chapter 22 is the last chapter. So we're going to finish off chapter 22 and then do some housekeeping because I do have an announcement to make. And then we'll end the stream. This stream ended up being longer than I thought it'd be, just because I ended up rambling a bit. But that, to be fair, I am making up a little bit for like missing 2 podcasts. I know, right? I missed 2 podcasts, not just 1. And this coming Monday's podcast is going to be a hoot. But anyway, more on that later. Let's finish off with chapter 22. Chapter 22. Now for 3 years there was no war between Aram and Israel. But in the 3rd year, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went down to see the king of Israel. The king of Israel had said to his officials, who's talking here? Okay. Don't you know that Ramoth Gilead belongs to us, and yet we are doing nothing to retake it from the king of Aram? So he said to Jehoshaphat, will you go with me to fight against Ramoth Gilead? Jehoshaphat replied to the king of Israel. I need a voice for this guy. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. But Jehoshaphat also said to the king of Israel, first seek the counsel of the Lord. So the king of Israel brought together the prophets, about 400 men, and asked, shall I go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I refrain? Go, they answered, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand. But Jehoshaphat asked, is there no longer a prophet of the Lord here whom we can inquire of? The king of Israel answered Jehoshaphat, there is one prophet through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, because he never prophesies anything good about me, but always bad things. He is Micaiah, son of Imlah. The king should not say such things, Jehoshaphat replied. So the king of Israel called out to one of his officials and said, bring Micaiah, son of Imlah, at once. Dressed in their royal robes, the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, were sitting on their thrones at the threshing floor by the entrance of the gate of Samaria, with all the prophets prophesying before them. Now Zedekiah, the son of Kenana, I think it's Kenana. It's a hard name to pronounce. Had made iron horns, and he declared, this is what the Lord says. I remember the voice I gave Elijah, and now I totally blanked out. I was like, oh, that was the voice I gave him. Now I wasted it. Anyway, this is what the Lord says. With these you guys will gore the Arameans until they are destroyed. All the other prophets were prophesying the same thing. Attack Ramoth Gilead and be victorious, they said, for the Lord will give it into the king's hand. The messenger who had gone to summon Micaiah said to him, look, the other prophets without exception are predicting success for the king. Let your word agree with theirs and speak favorably. But Micaiah said, as surely as the Lord lives, I can tell him only what the Lord tells me. When he arrived, the king asked him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead or not? Attack and be victorious, he answered, for the Lord will give it into the king's hands. And the king said to him, How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? Then Micaiah answered, Well, I saw all Israel scattered on a hill, like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, These people have no master. Let each one go home in peace. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, Didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad? Micaiah continued, Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, with all the multitudes of heaven, standing around him in his right and on his left. And the Lord said, Who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth-Gilead and going to his death there? One suggested this and another that. Finally, a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. By what means? The Lord asked. And I will go out and be a deceiving spirit in the mouths of his prophets, he said. You will succeed in enticing him, said the Lord. Go and do it. So now, the Lord has put a deceiving spirit in the mouths of all the prophets of yours. The Lord has decreed disaster for you. Then Zedekiah, the son of Kenaanah, went up and slapped Micaiah in the face. Which way did the spirit from the Lord go when he went from me to speak to you? He asked. Micaiah replied, You will find out on the day you hide in an inner room. The king of Israel ordered, Take Micaiah and send him back to Amon, the ruler of the city, and to Joash, the king's son, and say, This is what the king says. Put this fellow in prison and give him nothing but bread and water until I safely return. Micaiah declared, If you ever return safely, the Lord has not spoken through me. Then he added, Mark my words, all you people. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, went up to Ramoth-Gilead. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I will enter the battle in disguise, but you wear your royal robes. So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. Now the king of Aram had ordered his 32 chariot commanders. I need a voice for this guy. Do not fight with anyone, small or great, except the king of Israel. When the chariot commanders saw Jehoshaphat, they thought, Surely this is the king of Israel. So they turned to attack him. But when Jehoshaphat cried out, the chariot commanders saw that he was not the king of Israel and stopped pursuing him. But someone drew his bow at random and hit the king of Israel between the sections of his armor, basically like a joint point. The king told his chariot driver, Wheel around and get me out of the fighting. I have been wounded. All day long the battle raged, and the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Arameans. The blood from his wound ran onto the floor of the chariot, and that evening he died. As the sun was setting, a cry spread through the army. Every man to his town! Every man to his land! And so the king died and was brought to Samaria, and they buried him there. They washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria, where the prostitutes bathed, and the dogs licked up his blood, as the word of the Lord declared. As for the other events of Ahab's reign, including all that he did, the palace he built and adorned with ivory, and the cities he fortified, Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Israel? So Ahab rested with his ancestors, and Ahaziah his son succeeded him as king. So Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, became king of Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shilhi. In everything he followed the ways of his father Asa, and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel. As for the other events of Jehoshaphat's reign, the things he achieved and his military exploits, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? So he rid the land of the rest of the male shrine prostitutes who remained there even after the reign of his father Asa. There was no king in Edom, a provincial governor ruled. Now Jehoshaphat built a fleet of trading ships to go to Ophir for gold, but they never set sail. They were wrecked at Ezion-Geber. And at that time, Ahaziah, son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, "Let my men sail with you." But Jehoshaphat refused. Then Jehoshaphat rested with his ancestors, and was buried with them in the city of David his father. And Jehoram his son succeeded him as king. Now Ahaziah, son of Ahab, became king of Israel in Samaria in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel for 2 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, because he followed the ways of his father and mother, and of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who caused Israel to sin. He served and worshipped Baal, and aroused the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, just as his father had done. Alright, so that is the end, actually, of the Book of Kings. First Kings, anyways. We will continue with Second Kings, because really Second Kings just picks up with, like, some stories during Ahaziah's reign. But of course we go back to the prophets. Spoiler alert. We go back to Elijah at the start of Second Kings. But basically it's still during the time of, like, Ahaziah when he becomes king, and he only reigns for a couple of years. But then you've noticed that he doesn't really do much during that anyway, right? So just how it be, I guess. But anyway, about chapter 22. So basically we get this this other prophet, some random prophet, I guess, one of the other 7,000, right, in Israel, a dude named Micaiah. And this guy, you know, I guess he's got a notorious reputation for, like, not being, you know, for always saying, like, being the bad prophet, I guess. Now, of course, with that being said, this story brings up a very interesting problem, if you will, in, I guess, a problem with how people perceive Christianity and the Bible and all that. And Micaiah kind of adds to this problem. Sorry, my guy, but I guess you just got to take the hit for it. So anyway, there's this interesting passage there. I should probably get my Bible open again and look up the exact verses. I mean, I do encourage you guys to read this again yourselves anyways, but I'll just get the exact verses anyways for you. And that is, where is it? It starts from, like, verse 19, chapter 22, from verse 19 to, like, 28, about 10 verses in. There's this weird story that Micaiah tells. And he tells a story about how God sent a deceiving spirit. Now, of course, we run into the same problem we ran into the book of Samuel, right? Where there's these evil spirits that hang around God and then they do stuff for God, right? Which makes people wonder, it's like, well, wait, if God is all good, then why does he have these evil spirits around, right? And so you think of like, how do I put this? Back in the book of Samuel, let me backtrack a bit. Back in the book of Samuel, we had this whole thing with like Saul's depression. And Saul's depression, the Bible tells us, was from an evil spirit. This evil spirit tormented Saul. And apparently the Bible tells us that God, it came from God, right? Which makes people go, huh? But isn't God supposed to be all good? Why would he have these evil spirits and why would he send them on people, right? And so, if God didn't do that, if God didn't have these evil spirits around tormenting Saul, then Saul would never have, gone into his descent of madness, right? Now, I did try to use the Boethian's version of the Augustine's problem of evil, which was the idea that there's the absence of God, there is evil, right? If God is good, then the absence of him is simply evil, right? That was kind of a simplified version of that idea. And so evil exists in the world because there are things that we do that we basically remove God from it. For example, like, okay, God says don't murder. So you're going to say, well, I'm not going to listen to God, therefore I'm pushing God out. And then that will lead to murder, right? And that would lead to something evil because you actively have pushed God out of the picture. There was this funny little skit I remember in my days as a youth, and I was in youth group, and there's a little skit that the youth pastor was doing with some of the other youth leaders, right? And so he did this little skit where the youth pastor, he plays like a young adult, teenager / young adult, and I mean he was a young adult himself, but that's besides the point. So he plays this young adult guy, right? And there's God, and God played by someone else, and basically the young adult basically is like, okay, I want to do this thing, I want to like look at porn or something, so I'm gonna put a blindfold on God so God doesn't see me look at porn. So he puts a blindfold on the guy, right? And the other youth leaders, being the actor for God, and he puts a blindfold on him, and then he goes, okay, now he can't see me do these things that I want to look at, right? Then it's like, well, then I'm gonna like, oh, I want to talk about these like inappropriate things. I want to talk about, I want to gossip and stuff like that. But I don't want God to hear that I do that. So he grabs like these big headphones and puts it on the other guy's ears, right? Okay. Now that I'm doing that, and then I have God blindfolded and I have a big headphone on him, but I don't want him to like, call to me and tell me to take these things off. So I'm gonna like bound his mouth too. So he puts a thing around the other guy's mouth, and then he's like, well, there's nothing to stop God from like, taking those things off. So he puts God in a chair and ties him up. And then, the skit goes, kind of does the skit. How the skit goes is that, okay, now all these things go, the guy does whatever he wants, and then stuff starts going badly, whatever, right? And as things get worse, the young adult character gets sex addicted because of, all the porn and stuff like that. And then, of course, he can't trust anybody because of the gossip that he's been doing. And then, of course, people gossip about him naturally and stuff like that. And then, as his life starts spiraling downward, starts getting, hanging with the wrong crowds and all that and doing all these bad things. And then later, he comes back to God, who's still sitting in the chair, bound to the chair with the blindfold, the headset, and the gag, right? And he goes, "Why weren't you there in my life, God?" Right? Because the idea was that the person intentionally did that to himself, right? He pushed God out of his life. He incapacitated God himself, kind of thing. And then, well, when you do that, then of course God's gonna do nothing in your life, right? And so then, this is a sad ending. The guy's like, well, You were never there for me, right? And then what's the point of living, right? If you are never there. But of course, the point of the scale is to show that, well, the reason why a lot of that happens is because we ourselves do that by rejecting God and his rules and all that stuff and all his statutes and all that. As he tells Israel to do, right? Follow my statutes and you will be fine, right? Basically. And so going back to the evil spirit thing, right? Now I know when people read those parts of the Bible, it becomes problematic. And this is where one of those things where it's like, we have to assume what Micaiah is saying is true, because after all, it's his prophecy that ends up being the correct one, because he's the one who predicts that the king is going to die in this fight. And he does, right? Ahab gets shot, gets fatally wounded at random, right? And so, quote unquote, random, right? And this one of those things is like, well, I guess it's like God uses whatever means to make things occur, right? So it appears random, but it's one of those like, how does it go? If you ever watch Kung Fu Panda, right? That old Chinese philosophy thing. One often meets their fate on the road they take to avoid it. So basically, when Ahab tries to escape his fate, that Micaiah prophesies, and Micaiah is the only one that does this. Micaiah is the only one that predicts that the king will die. Everyone else says, "Oh, you'll be fine. Everything's gonna be great. You're gonna be victorious." Blah blah blah. And then Micaiah tells a story about an evil spirit that God allows to deceive the people. Right? Now, some people would interpret this passage to behave in the way that the book of Job does. And I know I often come back to the beginning of the book of Job because it's a lot of people have problems with it, just as a Bible story in general. In the beginning of the book of Job, for those of you who don't know, what happens is basically God is just chilling out, I guess, and then Satan walks up to him, and then Satan asks him a request, and God grants it to him. And what the request is he wants to play a game with God, and God says, "Okay, I'll entertain you." And then Satan goes, "Well, the game is going to be, you see this guy Job? I think that he only worships you because of how good you made his life. But if I totally screw up his life, he will curse you." And God goes, "Bring it on." The fact that God even entertains that idea sounds ridiculous. But God goes, "Okay, bring it on. I'll play your game." And so the devil goes, or Satan goes, "I'm going to destroy his stuff." And God goes, "Okay, I'll give you permission. Just, you're not allowed to hurt him though, right? That would defeat the point of your game." So he does, Satan does that, and then, but it's not enough, right? At least Satan doesn't think it's enough, right? So Satan comes back and he's like, "Okay, I'm going to kill his family." And then God actually gives him the go, right? Like God actually allows, Satan to do this. There's those weird moments, like the fact that happens, that God allows, Satan in the beginning of the Job story to destroy Job's stuff and then kill his family after. People would bring the question, why would, that makes God really mean that he allows, evil spirits to do that, and but the reason why I bring up that story is because apparently this is not a one-time thing. That's what I'm suggesting here in this story, in the Micaiah story, the story Micaiah tells, and it's that this is not a one-time thing that God just like Satan just walks up to God, I guess, like casually, right? And when Satan wants to do something, God's like, okay, he gives him the green light, which sounds ridiculous because, like, okay, God is allowing someone to do evil, right? Now, of course, there's an interesting parallel that we should read within the lines here, within Micaiah's story, the Job story, and in stories in general. And of course, this comes back to the human condition, right? That human beings, God has to greenlight anything we do, right? Good and bad things that we do, because no human being is exempt from them. But God has to be okay with it. Because once again, I brought this illustration up poorly, so I'll do it better this time. If God were to magically just stop bad things from happening, right? And I used the school shooter illustration, right? But if God were to just stop people magically all the time, then he would be, you know, he would be a ruthless dictator, right? And that would eliminate the idea that God is love, right? Which sounds weird, right? And it's a weird answer that I know a lot of people may not accept this answer. But when people think about why God allows bad things to happen, it's because since God is love, which is one of the primary features that the New Testament emphasizes about God's character. If God is to be love, he must allow evil to occur. And the reason for this is because if he prevents that from happening, if he's always stopping it from happening, then he is taking away from you the ability to love. He's taking away from human beings the ability to love. And if God is taking that away from humans, then how can he himself say that he's loving? So let's bring this to a more human level to try and make sense of this idea. So there's an old saying, and any guy who's gone through a heartbreak knows this saying, right? If you love her, you let her go, and if she comes back, then you know she's yours. That's kind of how the saying goes, something stupid like that, right? So, but in actuality, what it really happens is if you love a girl, you let her go, she comes back, she's there to kick your ass. That's how it normally really goes. But that's besides the point, right? So, anyway, the idea behind that, saying is the idea that real love requires the sacrifice to be able to lose it, right? But of course, to lose love yourself is a very painful thing, and it's in a way a bad thing to happen, right? Let's to break it down a bit, think of it like this: if you love something, it has to be able to hurt you, and by extension of that, if you love something, you have to be willing to give it up despite how much that will hurt, if that makes sense, which sounds counterintuitive, right? If you love something, wouldn't you want to naturally just be possessive of it, to always to make sure to do whatever you can to never lose it, right? But of course, people tend to view this as a vice. We call that being obsessive and overly possessive, right? Smothering is the word we use for it, right? And so, for example, parents have, this is a thing that a lot of parents struggle to do, right? It becomes a challenge for parents as they get older. Because, of course, when parents get older, they themselves become physically weaker. And then, of course, they start believing that they no longer have the capacity to lose things, right? Because they're physically weaker, so they don't know if they have the capacity emotionally as well. And so when their children grow up and become more independent, right, that is when a parent will be tempted to start smothering them and to be like, no, to always keep the child nearby. But we tend to view that as a negative thing, right? We would tend to view that as an overly possessive parent, right? It's exactly the same in God's case, in a lot of ways. It's exactly the same, right? So if God is to be loving, he must allow things like that to happen, because God has to be willing to lose, the thing he loves, aka us, right? God has to be willing to lose it, which sounds counterintuitive, right? But similar to how if you love someone or you love something, right, you have to be willing to lose it. You have to be willing not just to lose it, but to give it up too, right? Because once again, if you act overly possessive, then you become a tyrant, right? And going back with the parent illustration, when parents do that when their kids are becoming older, sometimes that can take a really bad turn, and some children take that extremely negatively and almost emancipate themselves from their parents from time to time because of how damaging that can be, right? But parents that are stronger and more mature, they know to be willing to take that risk, even if some awful things might happen, right? But the alternative is, you know, to be the one who severs your relationship, right? That's worse. And so the parents that are loving, truly loving, they're willing to let their kids make their own choices, even if it's against their own wishes, because they know that since they love their children, they want to respect their individuality. They they want, their children to thrive. They want their children to be their own, they want them to become independent, right? To be parents like they were one day. But in order for that to happen, that sacrifice must occur, right? And so going back to why God allows evil spirits and stuff like that to do what they do, using the Job story and the Micaiah story, it's because God does it because he knows he can't be overly possessive, right? Even though, yeah, people will then bring up, well, doesn't God say he's a jealous God and doesn't want to lose people? It's like, yeah, there's obviously God's going to say that I don't want to lose you, just like how any guy would say he doesn't want to lose his girl. Like, no, duh. You don't want to lose them. But real strength is to be okay if you do lose it and be willing to risk it. And that's a scary thing, right? And I know some people would say, well, that shouldn't occur with God, once again, because he's all powerful and all knowing. So that shouldn't be the case. But it shows that bit of humanity within the person of God, right? Because that's the other thing too, and I always bring this up too, so I'm going to bring it up again about like when we understand God as a being and God as a person, and there's kind of a divide between those two things, right? God as a being, this all-powerful, all-knowing entity, right, that, knows you better than you do, right? There's God the being, and then there's God the person, right? And of course, God the person is the idea that he's someone you relate to, you can and must relate to. And in any relationship with any person, God included, there is going to be tensions. That's just the way it is, right? Because once again, a relationship with no tension is no relationship at all, right? That's a slave and master relationship, not a relationship between friends, between loved ones, right? And so this is one of the weird the arm wrestle things that, even God has to deal with, which sounds weird when you say it out loud, that God himself deals with this himself. But that is also part of the nature of God being loving. And so that's how we have to reconcile that, right? That, well, in order for God to be loving, he must allow things like that to occur. Because otherwise he would be a smothering tyrant, right? An obsessive tyrant, and that would be worse. And of course, once again, the worst outcome would be then that would be antithetical to God being loving. Because then if he was a overly possessive tyrant, he wouldn't be loving then, right? He would be an overly possessive tyrant. So for God to maintain, for lack of better words, to maintain his loving nature, he must make that, sacrifice, and that is part of who he is all the time, right? And so there's this, now you get to the weird territory where God is always allowing these events to occur because he must always be loving and must always be willing to risk. There can never be a time where that risk, where God stops risking love. Let's put it that way, right? In order for God to always be loving, which is how we consider that God is love, because he is always loving, then he is always playing the risk game, if that makes sense, of being able to lose what he loves, aka us. God is always playing that game. See, human beings are different. We go back and forth between what is risky, love, and then being possessive, right? And that's part of human nature. Humans, we want to be possessive, right? Because of our mortality, we know that we can't afford to lose things because of our time limits. And if you lose something, you know how much of a drawback that is in your, set amount of time in life, right? So human beings have a tendency to be possessive, right? And anyone who's married or in a committed relationship knows this, right? like we know that, right? And so it's no different. It's not that, it's not a far stretch for God to be like always playing the risk game. Now you might ask, well, what does that have to do with God allowing evil? Well, why then must He allow evil? Isn't there another way of doing that, right? But once again, this is why the Augustine explanation of how evil works, right, in the absence of God, equating to evil, right? That's how that works. Because then, if God, who is love, right, divorces Himself from the risk of losing, what He has, aka His love for us, right? If He divorces Himself from that and compromises that, then He wouldn't be God, right? He wouldn't be trustworthy of being God, because He would then compromise, His God is love nature, in that the requirement for God, quote unquote, would be that He must always be loving, and in order to always be loving, He must always be risking. Whereas human beings, we're not required to do that, because once again, we're humans, we're not God, so we're not required to do that. But God puts that on Himself as a requirement, which is an interesting thing to think about. And that's one of the weird things about, like, when we talk about like God as a person, right, as opposed to God as a being, right? Because if God as a being has no limits, and you can kind of put whatever, lines you want to try and draw, and then they would just be subsumed by something else, because that's how an infinite being works. But when we talk about God as a person, or the personal God, that we can and must relate to, then God obviously puts limits on Himself for the purpose of maintaining, elements of His personality, right? That, for example, God is love. So therefore, God puts a limit on Himself, that He is always playing the risk game, as opposed to having His cake and eat it too, right? Which we don't expect God to do. But, I mean, that's part of, once again, God's love for us, is that He does it. Because that's how He shows us how loving He is, and that how much He loves us, right? Is that He's always playing the risk game. Whereas human beings, we are not required to do that. So, using human relationships as an example, once in a while, and this in human relationships is different. So it's not, I'm doing a little apples to oranges here, and you just kind of have to, because once again, it's kind of hard to explain God and then use human terms, because God isn't human in that sense, right? But work with me here. So in human relationships, we go back and forth between the risk play of love and then being possessive. As I mentioned earlier, anyone who's in a committed relationship and or is married knows this, right? There are times where, you let your partner do whatever they want, because you're more than cool with their life and the way they live it. You're more than cool with it, right? That's partly why you like them, right? And that shows that you love them, because you kind of allow them to do what they do. And you know the risk. You know the risk of doing that, right? You know the risk of not always, micromanaging your partner, that they might have an affair or something. That's always a possibility, right? And anyone who thinks their relationship is so perfect that will never happen, you're living in a dream world, right? And that's not real love, right? If you're not, like, the possibility must always exist, right? Because just because that person's features are attractive to you doesn't mean that, like, they might not be attracted to someone else. Obviously, they will be, and there will be, if you have a decent partner, then other people are going to see those same good qualities in them just like you do, right? So there's a possibility someone else may try and chase after them, and there's a possibility your partner may be seduced by someone else. That's always a possibility. So, but you allow, because you love them, you're willing to play that gamble, and you assume and you hope for that your partner is faithful, and more power to you, right? But there are times where you are going to be possessive, right? When some of those areas get blurred, let's say, oh, there's going to be this, gathering, and there's, your girlfriend's going to like a party, and there's going to be a lot of other guys there. Well, you're gonna be a little sus, right? And you're gonna be a little bit possessive. You're gonna be like, well, can I come too, so that I can keep an eye on you, kind of like, that's the implication, that I'm gonna keep an eye on you, kind of thing, right? And look out for these other guys, right? Because that's how it is with guys, right? Competitive, and always got to be the alpha male in the room, kind of thing, right? That's being a guy. So you have that possessive nature, and you go back and forth between that. Now, that's not the best analogy, because once again, that's a pretty minor example of being possessive, right? Because, I mean, then that would be a healthy amount, right? To kind of, okay, like, I want to see the kind of guys that right? These are the guys that you talk about and whatever. I want to see them. I want to check these guys out myself and make sure there's nothing funky going on, right? That's one thing, right? But then, of course, people. A good example just popped to mind. Now, I never run into this problem. I've never ran into this problem. But snooping on your phones. Snooping on phones. And some partners do it, and it's usually like a cause of tension in like romance dramas, because I watch way too many of those these days. But like, when the girl she's a little suspicious of her boyfriend, and then she snoops through his phone, which that's where it gets bad, right? So, if she loved her man, she'd be willing to, okay, let him do what do as he does, assume he's going to be faithful and whatever. But the moment she starts snooping through his phone, right, that's where you've crossed the line to being like overly possessive. Because it's one thing to like, okay, if you want to make sure that you know what your man's up to, but of course, ladies, you should just talk to the guy, right? Because if you have to snoop through a guy's phone, then clearly your communication skill sucks. But once the woman starts snooping through the man's phone, right, or vice versa, but we're just gonna use the typical example. I'm using romance dramas as my like reference here, because I watch way too many of those lately. But humor me here. So when the woman snoops through the man's phone, right, then she's crossed that line of being overly possessive, right? Because then she feels she has to control what he does, right? And who he talks to, which is why, girls go snooping through the phone, right? It's to see who he's talking to and whatever, right? And so when that happens, and this is where, like, once again, it's a breach of trust is what many people would define that as. And you can kind of reverse this and think about that's kind of what happens with God, right? If God were to do that, the snooping through the phone analogy, right, then he would no longer be trustworthy of being God, right? So he has to allow things like that to be okay, and he has to allow you to be able to do bad things, right? And he has to allow other, like other things like the spirit to deceive the prophets and basically turn all into a bunch of liars. These quote-unquote prophets, because once again, when it comes to Ahab, when he talks about prophets, we can never be sure, because Ahab himself, the Bible's not sure whether he, like, when he talks about God in general, this guy worships like how many gods, right? You don't know which one exactly he's talking about. I mean, just from the context of the Bible, we assume he's talking about the Lord, but are you sure? What about the prophets? We're not sure if they're all prophets of Yahweh. We don't know that. The Bible doesn't tell us that, nor does it feel the need to, because I think it's safe to assume that like a lot of them probably aren't. But then Micaiah shows up, and apparently he's the one guy that does, right? But of course, once again, there's the other problem with only Micaiah being the way that he is. Because he is then, he's kind of like the black sheep, right? Even among like, let's say there were some legitimate prophets within like Ahab's council, then Micaiah is still the black sheep, right, of that group. Assuming, let's say, if we took the pretense of they're all actual prophets of Yahweh, even though that's clearly pretty unlikely, then Micaiah is clearly this black sheep, right? And so there's that issue to contend with him as well. And I know I went on this crazy tangent because we're talking about Micah's story, right? And the spirit that says, I will put a deceiving message into these guys, right? So what's up with that is what you were asking. Well, what you would ask before I preemptively answered that with this long explanation. But that doesn't change the fact that, yes, I will acknowledge that does bring like a lot of problems, right? And especially when, like, let's say, like right now, for example, we're doing this Bible study here. And the reason why we should study it and really read the text and try and grasp what's going on, because it ain't easy, right? I mean, it's not like I have the answers to it. I'm just giving you what I think is going on and my interpretation and how I perceive it would play out in real life, right? That's why I use like my crappy rom-com examples and whatever, right? Is because that's how I assume it plays out in real life and in real time. Which of course is an exercise I always encourage all of you to do as well. But I won't deny that the Micaiah story is a very bizarre one, right, for him to tell. Because, yeah, like, why would he tell this story, right? And of course, there's the other thing about Micaiah that makes him a very troubling character to read in general. And I'm gonna go there. I'm going there. Here's your hot take of the week, as if there weren't already like a bunch of hot takes in this video. But here's your hot take of the week, which I haven't done in a while, at least not officially. But I hate to say this, and it's a scary prospect because then you don't want to raise like paranoia within like Christians themselves. But what is happening with Micaiah could very well be happening in the real world today, right? And many people talk about like bad Christians and good Christians, what makes a real Christian, blah blah blah. And there's like headbutts of that all over the place, right? And different church groups all fighting each other and conflict and all that. And it's not a pretty scene, but basically one of the things that's problematic when we read the Micaiah story is he's kind of pointing himself in this story as like, well, I'm the real prophet and everyone else is the false prophet, right? But he's like the black sheep of the group too, right? He's the clear minority of one, right? And this gets a lot of Christians thinking, well, am I part of the black sheep like Micaiah, or am I maybe been led astray and one of these other false prophets, but I don't know it, right? And that's a question to be fair though, to simmer down a bit, and my other hot take, my follow-up hot take, if you will, is that like, any self-respecting pastor should ask themselves that question. No one should be so arrogant to think that they're automatically the true prophet of God, right? That is a very pompous thing to think. So I would say, I would never say that like, oh yeah, I'm the Micaiah, I'm the black sheep, right? That's clearly right, and the rest of these other these other pastors who may say something different than me is clearly wrong. I would never say that, because I'm not that arrogant. At least I like to think I'm not that arrogant, right? But it is a scary thought, and I know that's probably a good reason why a lot of people don't talk about this guy's story, Micaiah. It's a pretty short story, right? Because he's like, she shows up here, and then he shows up like one more time way later, when he's released, because Ahab's dead and all that, and they're like, oh, this guy's still here. Why is he still rotting in this prison? And Micaiah's like, thanks, asshole. I've been here for like years. But I mean, his story in general is pretty weird one to consider, because it does bring up that scary possibility that, like, okay, I like to think that, I'm preaching the word of God correctly, reading his word and living my life accordingly and all that, and you know, preaching the message of Jesus to all of you and all that. And I like to think I'm doing that right, but that doesn't automatically mean I'm doing it right. Right? I like to think that I am, and I will keep doing what I'm doing based on my convictions. But at the same time, I would never be so arrogant to say that, like, yes, I am in fact, a true master of the light, kind of thing. Right? Like, I'll never make that kind of assertion, because who am I to say that, right? And so, but at the same time, any pastor worth his salt should always consider that, right? And of course, there's the other more practical side of that. It's like to be humble, right? Because the prideful pastor, once you've crossed that line, your Joel Osteens and whatever. Oh man, I'm gonna get hate for that one. But you're Joel Osteens and them, right? Once you've crossed that threshold, it's very hard to come back from, right? It is once you fall into that abyss, it is very hard to come back from, right? And so, it is better to always question and even be doubtful at times than to assume that you're right, even when everyone else knows you're wrong. If that makes any sense, right? Which perhaps is where that one proverb comes from. It is better to be silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt, right? So maybe it is a healthy thing for all pastors, and this is my word to you, pastors. And I know it's fun on one of those funny things too, just on a weird comedic side note. But it's like October is like also apparently Pastor Appreciation Month, which all the stuff I say in any October video coming up, you're probably going to question whether I should be a pastor worthy of any appreciation. You should check out Monday's video, because that's going to be a hoot and a half. But anyway, back on track here. Any pastor worth his salt, and this is my word to you for Pastor Appreciation Month. It's okay to question yourself. We can't all assume we're the Micahs, because then the one guy who doesn't assume that is the Micah, and the rest of us are the other sheep, right? So, but at the same time, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of like questioning yourself, and when you question yourself a bit, that will allow you to go forward. And in my mind, that's what allowed me to move forward as well. In, for example, doing streaming Parson like this, right? Is that I do question myself in that regard. And any pastor with this salt should. And so that's the big takeaway from the Micaiah story. And we'll come back to him when the last bit of his story shows up, but I mean, really, it's just him saying, like, I told you so, and thanks for keeping me in prison for years, jackass, is basically his last part of the story. The Michael Ewan abridged version. But basically, reread the Micah story, or the Micaiah. I keep calling him Micah. Well, that's because Micaiah is a longer version of it. Micaiah, right? But, and it's easy just to say Micah, but it's Micaiah. But then again, I guess it's how everybody just calls me Mikey instead of Michael, right? So maybe same kind of thing. But anyway, the Micaiah story in a nutshell, quote unquote 40-minute nutshell. But it's a good story to consider, and the reason why I put a lot of emphasis on it is because it is a little bit of a troubling story as like part of the whole, as you go through the whole biblical narrative. But at the same time, it does bring up a lot of good questions that, especially as believers, we should always consider, right? And to think about and to meditate on as we read through Scripture, right? And to think about, the kind of stuff that goes on in this story. Anyway, I've probably exhausted that topic, so this is going to be the end. However, I do have a couple of announcements. The first one, unfortunately, is that I originally said way back was that I was gonna have Taki on this channel, and I'm hoping I'm hoping that we could still do our little Halloween feature. I'm really hoping, but he has put a red light on not doing the 18th. Life has just been really tough for him and crazy, so I don't want to burden him. You know, to my brothers and sisters here, you know, let's give our prayers to Taki that he'll recover soon. Because, you know, I'm on the one hand, I really want him on this channel. He really wants to do it too, but it's just because of like there's a lot of stressful stuff going on in his life, and I don't want to burden him too much. So that's going to be put on hold. And hey, you know, there might be a possibility we may just do his Halloween themed podcast that he really wants to do. We might even do it after Halloween as like a just after Halloween thing. But hey, I mean, if Rabtoons can get away with doing their Silent Hill Halloween specials, which I will be watching, if they do in November, I'm sure it's cool if I have Taki on here in November. But with that said, I will have a Halloween somewhat themed podcast on Monday, which will just be me, as usual. So I do have a Halloween themed podcast that I'm still kind of writing the script for Monday. It's going to be a hoot and a half, so I'm sure you guys will enjoy that one. That will be this Monday on the 18th. So early Halloween video, quote unquote. Excuse me, early Halloween video, quote unquote. On the 18th, you're going to be doing a Halloween podcast with me. And that will be at 4 p.m. Pacific time. Aside from that, the rest of the week will be pretty regular. So we got a Halloween stream on Monday the 18th. Then Throwback Thursday, more Heroes by Magic 2, Price of Loyalty. I think I'm starting the final map of Descendants this week. So there's that. And then next Friday, we will begin Second Kings. So, and that will be at 3 o'clock, just like as it was. I would know I was a little bit late today, a couple minutes, but you know what I mean. Who's really counting it when it's like such a small amount? But basically, next week podcast Monday, 4 o'clock. Thursday, Throwback Thursday video. I'll try and have it uploaded earlier. I need to stop like putting it off and not and upload it earlier. And then of course next Friday at 3 o'clock we'll do our beginning of Second Kings. So this is gonna be the end of the video, the end of the stream. We finished through First Kings as planned. It took a lot longer than I thought it did because my notes here are actually very short. I did not put that many. I don't know how I ended up talking for 2.5 hours, but you know, I guess we'll call it the makeup for missing 2 podcasts and a Bible stream for the last couple weeks. So with that said, though, I hope you guys enjoyed going through the Book of Kings with me, and we'll continue in 2 Kings next week. Hope you guys have a great Friday night. Hope you guys have a great rest of your weekend, and God bless you.